Hello, I'm Dr. Sean Roberson, and I'm here today to do a webinar CLE on the effective use or impeachment of mental health expert witnesses, what every attorney should know. I am a forensic psychologist here in Oklahoma City and practice around the state as well as in Kansas and Texas. I have a background in counseling psychology and specialty training in forensics. I teach at the University of Central Oklahoma's Forensic Science Institute as an adjunct and have a private practice where I primarily work in the criminal forensic realm, but I also do some civil work and general psychological work as well. So today the objectives are that I'd like to talk with you about when clients could benefit from referral for a mental health examination, as well as the type of professionals that you should consider hiring in various types of cases. I'd like to go over some of the general ethical principles that are involved in conducting forensic mental health evaluations, as well as inform you of some of the guidelines and standards that you might want to have copies of when you're dealing with mental health experts. We're going to talk about the techniques to gauge the quality of work being offered to your clients, as well as specific techniques for improving both the direct exam and the redirect of your witness, as well as methods of cross-examining opposing witnesses. First of all, I'd like to start by saying that when I refer to forensic, I'm essentially referring to anything that involves psychology and the law. So it's not necessarily criminal. As you know, mental health experts are used in a variety of contexts. It could be custody, it could be a malpractice lawsuit, it could be for pain and suffering, a disability claim, or the like. So when should you refer your client to a mental health professional? Obviously, there are some blatant times if they've been in an inpatient psychiatric setting in the past for problems related to a major mental illness. These would be things like mood disorders, which are major depression, bipolar disorder, or a psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia. If they have difficulties with reality testing, they have delusions or beliefs that are not based in reality, or they're experiencing hallucinations, hearing sounds or voices or seeing things that aren't there, that's an obvious sign for referral. If they are receiving psychotropic medications, particularly antipsychotic or mood-stabilizing medications, that might be an appropriate time for a referral. Oftentimes, if you're dealing with children or adolescents, they get referred to mental health professionals for behavioral problems. It is rare for us to see a young child who suffers from a major mental illness. They typically do not experience psychosis at that young of an age. It's normally going to be a behavior disorder like oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder. I will mention that bipolar disorder is diagnosed in children, but that's a contention within the field as to how often it's accurately diagnosed. It's really a very rare disorder among adults and especially among children. Whenever your client may have had a history of any kind of intellectual or disabilities or developmental disabilities, that might be a time for a referral. I don't know if you're aware, but the new Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders just came out, the 5th edition. They have reclassified the term from mental retardation to an intellectual disability. So you'll hear that term used in place of that in today's presentation. If your client may have had some type of a traumatic brain injury, if they're aged, or if they've had long-term alcoholism or abuse of illicit drugs that could have impacted their cognitive capacities, and you're concerned about dementia, that might be an appropriate time for a referral. Oftentimes we see that attorneys refer their clients just because they're difficult to deal with. They can't have what they view as a rational conversation with them. They're not realistic in terms of what the attorney is recommending for how to proceed in the case, or they can't stay on track during conversations. Oftentimes you might not know exactly what is going on with your client, and so that might be a time to have a mental health professional look at them. There are a whole range of diagnoses called personality disorders. Personality disorders are essentially an impaired development of your personality. It's impairment in the way you think, in the way you feel, and the way you behave. But it's not a mood disorder, although they can experience mood symptoms like depression at times because their personality seems to get them into predicaments. It's not a psychotic disorder. People with personality disorders can exhibit a lot of the same traits as people with mental illnesses. So oftentimes you need a professional to be able to determine, is this just the person's interpersonal style? Do they have a personality disorder, or could they really be suffering from a condition that might benefit from some form of treatment? And then finally, mitigation is an area where oftentimes attorneys feel they might need an expert. And that is, in a criminal case, for example, does the defendant suffer from some condition that the court or the prosecution might consider as mitigating their particular circumstance, whether they have a low IQ, whether they were suffering psychosis, whether they have substance abuse issues that might be amenable to treatment, whether they have positive assets as well, if they have reliable work history, family involvement, involvement in the community, whether they have a lack of dangerousness. So we can perform an assessment specifically to look at what their risk of reoffending is, as well as sexual offenders and what their risk of reoffending is. And so in many cases, if their risk level is low, that might mitigate the punishment they would receive. So the next question is, what type of professional should you refer your clients to? I'm going to speak specifically more about psychology programs. Psychology programs are accredited by the American Psychological Association. These are typically doctoral level programs, and they're housed in accredited universities. There are some programs called PsyDs instead of PhDs. PsyDs can be in accredited schools as well. But bottom line is that the individual you retain should be from an APA accredited program. There are no legitimate online programs. I will mention that right off the bat. There are also no forensic doctoral programs. So although somebody like myself may refer to their background as being a forensic psychologist, the degree is actually a PhD in typically counseling or clinical psychology, and then you go on to get specialized training in forensics after that. So it's kind of akin to how medical doctors are generally trained, and then they may choose to become a psychiatrist and do a residency in that. APA takes the stance of we should all be trained as generalists to begin with. So, whether you should use a forensic versus a non-forensic expert. Use of non-forensic experts, if you're going to bring them into a legal case, can be very tenuous. This could be because they may not be familiar with some of the forensic guidelines that are used when things end up in litigation, or when it's in a court case, or when they testify. They may also approach the case like it's a typical civil case, and there's a big difference between how most mental health professionals practice and how those of us who practice in a forensic context prepare in terms of the information we might gather, how the reports are written, and I'll get to that here in a little bit. They may also not be aware of some of the tests that are typically used in forensic context. They may also find it difficult to testify. Most psychologists get into the profession because they're interested in helping people, not because they're interested in being cross-examined by attorneys, as you might imagine. So many of them might find the situation to be quite uncomfortable. They may even become agitated with cross-examination, and that could cause some difficulties. So you may want to look at to what degree that is important in your case. Whether you need to hire a generalist versus a specialist. A generalist is, we're all trained in doing the same basic things. So we're all trained in evaluating for intelligence, personality, psychopathology. You may have a need for somebody with a particular niche. Let's say that you get into a particular brain dysfunction. You might need a neuropsychologist. Or if you're getting into a criminal competency, you'll probably want somebody with that specific training. Finally, I would also recommend that whenever you refer your clients to somebody, or if you're contacting a mental health professional, be specific. Don't just ask for a psych eval, which is what we get a lot of calls about. that would be akin to somebody calling your office and saying, I need legal help. They need to be very much more specific about what is the purpose of the psychological evaluation. Do you want a diagnosis? Do you want to know what was going on with them at the time of a particular event? Do you want to know if it's personality versus psychopathology? Is there some ultimate legal question to be answered? And now on to what type of professional should you refer them to. There are several different types of professionals you have to choose from. Probably the most frequent in Oklahoma and around the country are licensed psychologists. Licensed psychologists could have a degree which is a PhD or a PsyD, as I mentioned earlier, or EDD, which is a doctorate of education. That's less often seen. Licensed psychologists have specialization in psychological testing, and that's really the key thing that makes them beneficial to use in many circumstances. They're also trained, obviously, in making diagnoses and in writing reports. It's important to know that whenever you hear the term psychologist, that actually means that they are licensed in the state by the Psychology Board. The Psychology Board only licenses doctoral level individuals as psychologists. Each state has its own board and it's not transferable. So if you're using an out-of-state expert, they have to be registered with the state board to come perform an evaluation. There are a couple of exceptions of when people can use the term psychologist and they're technically not licensed psychologists. This can cause some confusion. I had a recent case where I was contacted by an attorney, and he had somebody who had a doctorate who had written a report about an individual's intelligence, and they referred to themselves as being a psychologist, but upon further review they were not a licensed psychologist. What it was is they had worked for a school system at the time. They had a master's degree in school psychology in addition to a doctorate. School psychologists who are at the master's level are allowed to refer to themselves as school psychologists. They cannot use the term psychologist alone. But that is one exception that can cause some confusion. The next type of professional would be a licensed psychiatrist. They would have an MD or a DO. Licensed psychiatrists typically specialize in obviously the administration of medication. Psychologists do not prescribe medication in just about every state. There are a couple of exceptions. Psychiatrists are who you're going to want to refer to if it is a medication issue. Psychiatrists also do diagnoses. Psychiatrists are not trained in their medical training to do psychological testing that can often be crucial in some of the forensic-related cases. However, they can gain some of that training through professional education once they are further into their careers. So if you're looking for testing, you're typically going to think more of a psychologist. If you're looking for medication issues, more of a psychiatrist. We do see that psychiatrists can practice in the forensic realm as well. Finally, we have master's level clinicians. So here in Oklahoma, that would be licensed professional counselors, licensed clinical social workers, licensed behavioral practitioners. We don't encounter a lot of master's level individuals involved in forensic cases when they go to court. Attorneys typically prefer to hire somebody at the doctoral level. That's not to say that master's level individuals aren't qualified or can't do such cases at times. So how do you decide who you're going to hire once you've decided what type of expert you need? Obviously, getting the curriculum vitae or the resume is important to review that to see, do they have a license? What program did they go to? Do they have the experience you're looking for the particular issue you're trying to address? Also, you want to look at whether they have any licensure sanctions. That's something that's not often done. You can contact the licensure board for whatever profession it is and ask them about that. And I would suggest that that's something that you might want to examine doing. Also, you're going to want to look at if they have a website. Do they have any articles on that or make any statements on that that might conflict with how you're going to approach the case or cause difficulty once it goes to litigation? Also, do they have any publications? So one of the things you could simply do is do an internet search on their name and to see if they're authored what they have authored. You can also ask them specifically whether they've had any sanctions, whether they've had any negative experiences in a particular county where they might be testifying. Another important point is when is it important to discern what the degree versus the license is? When is a doctor really a doctor? There are a number of professionals who have doctorates but are not licensed at the doctoral level. And so they might have a master's degree and be licensed as, say, an LPC, and they refer to themselves as Dr. So-and-so, and indeed they do have a doctorate, but they're not licensed at that level. So they may not be a licensed psychiatrist or a psychologist. That's also important to be aware of should the case proceed. You also have diplomates, which is essentially a credentialing process. There are only a handful of diplomates in forensic psychology in Oklahoma, and even around the country it's pretty rare. It's not necessary to have. It's a nice feather in your cap, if you will. It doesn't ensure appropriate practice, but it does ensure they've taken some extra steps, typically in terms of learning the law, learning case law, and other relevant things. You need to be aware of what we call vanity diplomates, and these are diplomates that are put out by organizations that are, some of them are just strictly for profit. And so an example of this would be the American College of Forensic Examiners Institute, or the ACFEI. PBS did an investigative report on them several years ago called the Real CSI. And what they found was that it was essentially an open book test. A professor in journalism had his student who had no forensic experience apply, pay the fee, fill out the open book test, and suddenly they were a credentialed examiner in forensics. Obviously, you should be very concerned about anybody who has credentials like that and tries to present them in court. When you hire an expert, you want to ask about their typical patterns of being hired. Are they typically hired by the prosecution versus the defense? Are they typically hired by the plaintiff versus the respondent? And what are their track records and their findings? So if you take somebody, for instance, who sides with the father's side in 95% of custody cases, there might be some concerns there. You also want to see, like I said earlier, do an internet search and see if anything pops up on an individual. Sometimes I see attorneys also do email listserv inquiries where they might ask other attorneys around the state who they've used for particular types of cases and how that went. On to ethical principles and practice guidelines. So just like attorneys, psychologists have their own ethics codes. So do psychiatrists, so do LPCs, etc. If we violate our ethics codes, if we violate state statutes in terms of our practice, there can obviously be sanctions with the licensure board. We also have a set of lesser-known guidelines. And in psychology, it's the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists. You all should be aware of this anytime you deal with a psychologist practicing in the forensic realm. There's also guidelines for forensic psychiatrists as well. Guidelines are strong suggestions. So there may not be a licensure sanction if they're violated, but if they're violated, there needs to be an explanation for why they weren't following those practice guidelines, because they're standard among the profession. I strongly recommend having copies of the following documents for your office if you routinely deal with mental health professionals. First is the American Psychological Association's Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct. Secondly, the Specialty Guidelines for Forensic Psychologists. The American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law Ethics Guidelines in the Practice of Forensic Psychiatry. And then any other common licensure guidelines. So if you deal with the LPCs, you can get on the state's health department and you could find what their ethical guidelines are. Owning a copy of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition that came out in 2013 would be important. There's a set of texts that that not many attorneys are aware of, I found, that was put out by Ziskin and Faust many years ago. Ziskin and Faust were attorneys, mental health experts, I believe also. And it's called Coping with Psychiatric and Psychological Testimony. And it's kind of like an encyclopedia of dealing with mental health experts. It's got cross-examination techniques for virtually any area of mental health that you can think of. It has been out of print for a while, so it may be difficult to get a hold of, but if you can get that, that's a great asset for your office. There's a book called Psychological Evaluation for the Courts by Melton and some other authors. That's considered widely as being the Bible of forensic psychology and psychiatry, and it covers both criminal and civil areas. And then there's a recent article that's come out that I'd be happy to forward to any attorneys who want to contact me that's groundbreaking, called Are Forensic Experts Biased by the Side That Retained Them? And it was by Murray, and it was published in Psychological Science. There are also several co-authors to that, and I'm going to get to that study in a bit. So when we're looking at the ethical principles and the practice guidelines, we're looking at, did the expert do a number of things? One of the most important things is, did they weigh the data impartially, including rival hypotheses? This is one of the main shortcomings that I see in many of the mental health experts that practice, and that is they tend to tailor the report and tailor the data that they talk about to their particular conclusions. And one of the things that the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists tells us is that we should include information that is opposite of our conclusions. What we're looking for is a scientific approach where the data is laid out there and then it is explained why we reached one theory over another. The expert should also explore what is likely to come up as the main cross-examination techniques or the arguments by opposing counsel. This really ensures objectivity, and I think it improves the strength of your case. Did the expert avoid omissions, which can be misleading? So if the medical records they're reviewing provided two different diagnoses, one was a psychotic disorder, one was a drug-induced psychotic disorder, did they include both of them? Did they explain their methods and their findings in detail? And I'll get to that in a second. And then, are they practicing only in their areas of competency? If you have an expert and they are not outlining the specific statutes that relate to the issue you're needing examined, I would be concerned about that. So under reviewing work product for quality, are their methods of evaluation clearly outlined? So do they have the dates that they saw the individual and the time that they spent with them? If there are multiple authors, can you tell who did what and for how long they were there? Can you tell exactly what tests were given, and are they consistent throughout the report? You'd be surprised in some cases where one test might be listed in the methods section and a different test appears to have been given later in the report. Do they provide details about the documents that they reviewed? So if they say mental health records were reviewed, that's far too general. What facility were they from? What were the dates of treatment? You need to be able to obtain those records yourself to verify as those in many cases. Is it clear enough that you could actually track those records down? Secondly, were current versions of the tests used? So test publishers, as you might imagine, revise tests from time to time. And it's very important that we use the current updated test. You can do an internet search on a test to find what version it is on. I had a case not long ago where an attorney was preparing to submit a report by an expert, and the expert had used an intelligence test that had been replaced by 2 editions. It was about a 20-year-old intelligence test, and this really would have been damning to the case had that report not be kept out. And you can research that yourself. There's actually a book called Mental Measurements Yearbook that reviews every test that's in publication. And it outlines the validity, the reliability, the uses for various populations, things of that. So you could research that at your local library or university library. You need to watch out for people who use interns for a large proportion of the exam. So were they using less qualified assistants? Sometimes you'll see cases where individuals use unlicensed assistants, and they list that the evaluation was done both by them and the assistant, and then what you really come to find out is that maybe the assistant was there doing 90% of the exam. That's going to be concerning. Also, sometimes we see people who use individuals with lower level licensure. So I ran across several cases in the past few years where a psychologist was using a master's level LPC. Both their names were on the report because the psychologist was supervising the master's level individual. But in fact, the psychologist had never seen any of the people. And the courts and the attorneys were interpreting these reports as coming directly from the psychologist. The court record cited Dr. So-and-so's opinion, although he'd never actually seen the people. So you'll want to know exactly what proportion of time the individuals have spent with the examinee. Was collateral data even gathered is also important to know. So if they're writing a report where they're trying to build a history that somebody's had some type of a disability, some type of a mental illness, did they actually get releases of authorization to get records, and did they actually order those records? One of the problems with my profession is that when we practice outside of the forensic realm, much of what the examinee tells us is taken as being truth, or at least it's not looked at very skeptically. And oftentimes that's written in reports as if it's factual when the records are actually never ordered. So individuals may say, I've been at XYZ hospital, when in fact they've never been there. Did your expert gather the data, or the expert who you're evaluating their work? Is the report written in a clear and professional manner? So if they didn't obtain the records, in their report, are they saying that the examinee reported they were at a particular hospital, or are they writing it as factual and saying that the individual was at a particular hospital? That's a nuance, but that's an important nuance, because sometimes you can see psychological reports where the entire opinion can be undone because much of what it was based on has no basis in factual reality. And so if it's just reported from the examinee, it should be written that way. Do they appear to be using templates? This is less rare, but I think it does commonly occur in some circumstances and some particular types of evaluations where professionals may take a template. It's a report they often do, say it's a disability evaluation, and they just plug in the names of the individual that they're seeing. Sometimes they forget to plug in the names in all the places, and so if you see that, that should raise concerns about whether they're really being detail-oriented in this individual's characteristics and not just using something previously written about someone else. Some of the little-known facts about diagnosis, psychiatric and psychological diagnosis, is that it is grossly flawed in many instances. Now, we do have criteria in the DSM, and we are really pretty reliable and effective at making those diagnoses if we are gathering the appropriate data and if we're talking about well-trained clinicians. However, what we see in reality is you go to 10 different mental health professionals, you're probably going to have 10 different diagnoses. Diagnosis is not like drawing somebody's blood or DNA. It is subjective. It's largely based on what the examinee tells us they are experiencing. And it's also rarely scrutinized. It's based largely on self-reported symptoms, and that's probably the biggest weakness of psychology as a science. You should be particularly concerned about diagnoses if there's little data other than an interview. In order to gather information for diagnosis, not always, but many times it can be helpful to administer testing, like